Well, what you're describing to me seems like the general theme I seem to see throughout this kind of call it evangelical Protestant world, which is disintegrating.
Hmm.
It's essentially, I
Hmm.
mean, maybe that's too strong a word because it makes it
I
sound like
don't
it's
think
all
it
coming apart.
is.
But there is sort of this divergence or
Hmm.
this division into different tribes or different
Hmm.
groups. And, I don't know if you've got a chance to read Brad Vermeulen's book on the New Calvinist movement, Reform Resurgence, but he
Hmm.
talks about how New Calvinism emerged at a time when, there were some of these things happening in the world. So like the
Hmm.
new monastics and kind of
Hmm.
the neo Anabaptists were getting
Yeah.
big. There
Hmm.
was maybe a more emerging church wing, a more progressive
Hmm.
evangelical wing, and then
Yep.
so there are these different tribes and groups developing. I think the internet
Hmm.
has definitely created
Yes.
a tribalism, and so now we're
Hmm.
seeing more and more of these divisions. And I think in many respects that it's also that these divisions are between people who are explicitly hostile to one another. So it's
Hmm.
not like I'm splitting off and going my own direction. There's a
Hmm.
certain amount of they're sort of defined in part negatively in the sense that what we are
Yeah.
is we're not you or we're opposed to you.
Right. Right.
And I think again you're also seeing some of this in this kind of kind of called still the old call it the religious right people who are still
Hmm.
there versus the woke left, who's
Hmm.
there. And again, there's always kind of been this religious left, but it's certainly
Hmm.
becoming more one today. And you see these divides over things like race and gender. And I mean, I'm curious to see what you see and kind of how you think some of this is going to play out, and like where's this thing going?
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple different strands to that. So one of them, this is a study my pastor actually turned me on to. It's dated now because it was like 05, 06 that Barna did. But they listed out 9 different affirmations that you would expect evangelicals to affirm. And these are extremely bare bones. I don't have the list in front of me, but it was things like the Bible is God's word. I try to obey what the Bible teaches. I believe that Jesus is God's son. Very minimal. So in the middle of the Bush presidency, when you had all of these journalists writing these like looming theocracy, fearful books, about 35% of the country identified as evangelical in a lot of polling. Um, but if you looked at the Barna data, they found that only like 1/6 of the self described evangelicals they talked to affirmed all 9 of those statements, which, if the sample they had was sound and could be applied to the nationwide evangelical population of the time, would mean that when you actually drill down, there was only like 6% of the population that was evangelical. And I think if you understand that point, then a lot of the other stuff starts to kind of snap into place a little bit. Um, because you have this remaining 30% that 20 years ago self-described as evangelical, but did not affirm one element or another of what you kind of regard as the evangelical package traditionally. And so I think a lot of the breakdown comes out of that kind of chaos where you had a label that was describing a very large group of people that was not nearly so unified as the label would imply. So that creates one problem. I think the other thing, and this is something Brad touches on in a couple interviews about the book, Vermeulen, is that so much of the way these dynamics work, especially online, is it's very branding driven, it's very marketing driven. And so that's where you get the thing you're talking about with the attachment to certain persons and kind of figureheads in the movement. Um, and so you'll get people who they really, really like John Piper, but then John Piper retires, and now what?
Hmm.
Um, and you get these within those institutions, and you're seeing this in the Gospel Coalition right now. There's this question of kind of institutional succession, where TGC at its founding was this very interesting synthesis of Piper's kind of Southern pietism turned Minnesota kind of Baptist thing. And then you had Keller, and then you had Carson kind of providing a little bit of the academic background. But what we're dealing with right now is that most of Piper's Baptist successors are to his right. Like something I don't know why more people don't talk about it. Piper preached against racism annually. He did a thing every January. One weekend he would preach on race, and the next he would preach on abortion. And he said he did it specifically because the people that would get excited about the abortion sermon didn't want to talk about race, and vice versa. And he would hit both of them. And Bethlehem had a kind of affirmative action hiring policy for pastors when Piper was there. And Piper himself lives in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. But most of Piper's successors in the Baptist world are now to his right. I think a lot of the kind of quote-unquote Kellerite types in the Presbyterian world are probably to Keller's left. And so now you basically have Kevin DeYoung, who like is the obvious Keller successor in this scenario with no one running with him. And so it creates these very hard problems because when so much of it is driven by personality, which it probably has to be because of the way the internet works, it creates real challenges for institutional succession. And so I don't have any answers, but that's just been my observation. DeYoung did a thing where he was trying to kind of break down the different groups on his blog, and I thought it was insightful to a point, and yet because of the nature of the divide, what ended up happening is the two poles were both furious about it for different reasons, both of which I can understand. But it creates real questions around how do institutions transition from one generation to the next, because you're not just going to be able to clone John Piper or clone Tim Keller and keep things going. Cultural circumstances are going to change as well, such that what they were doing 20 years ago maybe isn't going to make sense in the same way right now. And so I think that's one of the real questions for this relatively small group of conservative Protestants that really are, by and large, unified theologically, is how do we handle these kind of generational shifts that we're living through right now, as like Piper is retired and is 75, I think, and Tim has cancer and is 70. So where does the leadership come from, and how does the coalition hold together?
Well, people are still looking to that generation for leadership, and I think, and definitely, even John MacArthur, they're still looking to John MacArthur, who's in his 80s. And I mean,
MacArthur has continued to put himself in leadership.
Yeah, well, the other guys haven't really gone away either, in a sense that they've retired from their pulpits, but they're on, they're still writing blogs and doing things.
Yeah.
And I do think there's an element of, the baby boomers, again, the baby boomers kind of got these positions and have not gone away. They've just held on to them. But there's also a sense in which certainly Generation X, my generation, was not interested in institutions and building institutions and being institutional leaders. And so I think there is a sense in which people did not necessarily step up. One of the most insightful things I heard was about a decade ago. It was probably 2012 or 13. I went to the Willow Creek Global Leadership Conference, which was this annual confab they did every year, where they brought in like top corporate speaker people, and it was Christian, but it was really sort of like you would expect of mainline evangelicalism, but it had a very practical thing, and a lot of non-Christians went to it as well. And
it's pitched in the business world a lot as just like how to be a good leader in the business world. It
was good. And Bill Hybels gave a talk. He said he went through how many mega churches there were in the world in 1970 and how many there were then, today, and how many of those were still led by their founding pastor, and that there was this looming succession challenge. And he was talking about his own succession plan, which did not actually turn out the way that he had hoped, probably.
Yeah.
But I think there, he's like, look, there's all these big institutions, big people that they're not that old. It's like the coalition; it's not old. And there is a sense in which everybody likes, this is why it's like, it's easy to plant churches, and even if you build a massive church that's very successful, like Redeemer Presbyterian, it's not that old. And it's easy to look at a lot of these mainline churches and say, oh, look at them. They got like 10 old people left. But yeah, they're 150 years old. They're 125 years old. When your churches, and all these church plants, if they make it to age 50, even some of them, when you're 125 years old, let's see who's in your church. And I think every institution has to figure out how to regenerate itself generationally, just like every city, too. It's like, the auto industry boomed in Detroit, then it went into a collapse. They couldn't reinvent themselves. Whereas a place like New York has been able to reinvent itself over and over and over again. And I think there's a lot of that to these institutions. Can these institutions actually transform themselves, or will many of them end up essentially being, one, maybe two generations before they kind of fall into decline?